ALC F.A.Q.
Hello, Abundant Life. Welcome back to the ALC F.A.Q. Abundant Life Church Frequently Asked Questions. Just an opportunity for you and I to explore what it means to have faith in the 21st century as abundant life. What is this life supposed to look like? I've been taking questions from the congregation for the last number of months, and I've really enjoyed my time. And I have a couple of questions from some new questioners this week, so I thought we would dive right in. Just as a reminder, if you want to, you can subscribe to both our YouTube channel as well as to these FAQs. Just click on the subscribe button below, hit the little bell, and that'll help you know as soon as anything new shows up. You can also click the like button if you do like this video. It does absolutely nothing for me other than let me know that somebody watched it and enjoyed it. And I'd love to read more questions and comments. If you want to interact on these issues any further, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at the church or you can give me a call. You can reach all of our contact information on our website, alc-calgary.ca. And like I said, love to hear from you. Let's dive into some questions, shall we? First question has to do with believing in God, comes from Betty, and the question is this. We've all heard people say, I believe in God. In fact, a lot of the polls in Canada and especially in the US show that a vast, overwhelming majority of people say they believe in God or in a higher power. But Betty's question continues, how do you get from I believe there is a God to I believe God? How do we move from believing in some kind of deity? How do we move that belief into I actually believe in this deity, and not just believe in this deity, but believe this God? How do you explain that to someone who says, well, of course I believe in God? Well, that's a fantastic question, Betty. Not an easy one either. And there are probably lots of ways that different people would answer this question, but I'm going to start with this premise. That oftentimes when people say, I believe in God, they are not being specific. And what they mean is, I believe in the general idea of God, that there is a higher power, that there's something beyond what we see that may or may not care about us, that may just exist to push the universe forward. A long time ago, there was a belief system that, well, it sort of found its legs in the Enlightenment period when they were trying to make everything reasonable and rational. And it was a belief system called deism. And deism was, I believe that there's a higher power kind of God who wound up the universe like a clock and then let it go. So it's a God who has power, but no ultimate interaction with us. And I think a lot of people actually believe that when they talk about believing in God, or they'll talk about believing in the universe or in powers beyond us. And the real difference for me in the way that Christianity is formulated is that it's not about vocal belief or verbal belief in a higher power. It is declaring a belief that goes beyond mental assent to some kind of relational, almost transactional understanding between us and between a personal God. That's what Christianity really focuses on, especially in the incarnation of Jesus. It's not enough, says Jesus, to believe in God. Even the demons believe, right? That's what the scriptures say. It's what do we do with that belief? Believing in a higher power doesn't necessarily do anything to you or for you. However, if we look at the word believe and change the connotation a little bit, I think it gets us to where we want to be. So let me try this on. There's a book that came out a while ago called Gospel Allegiance, I think is the name of the book. Salvation by Allegiance Alone is another version of the book. He wrote two books that were very similar by a guy named Matthew Bates. And Bates takes the tack that when we say believe in North American culture especially, what we mean is I have some kind of mental agreement that that thing exists. So if I believe in this book by David Bentley Hart. You don't have to believe in David Bentley Hart, by the way, but if I believe in this book, it means I believe that this book is solid and it exists, and if I drop it, I also believe in gravity, so it's going to land on my lap. But Bates says that's not really what belief looks like, what faith looks like, especially in the New Testament. The language of faith in the New Testament, the Greek word is pistis, which sounds bad, but it's not. And Bates makes a very convincing case that faith in the New Testament, the belief in the New Testament, is more closely aligned to the language that we would use for allegiance. So I'm an American by birth, and I learned really early on in my life the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and so on and so forth. I know the whole thing, but I don't want to pronounce it right now, because what Bates talks about is what gets to the real heart of this issue. Belief in a God is a wonderful thing, but allegiance to my God is something that involves the whole of me in actively pursuing and actively obeying and actively seeking this God, even as he's actually pursuing me. So when I say I believe in God, what I mean is the God of the universe, who is perfectly imaged in the person of Jesus Christ and who exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, three persons, eternally, interpenetratedly dwelling as a perichoretic unity. You don't have to worry about those words. I have pledged my allegiance and my life to that God in the belief that that God is my creator, my sustainer, my redeemer, and my everything. And my whole life is predicated on the fact that that God not only exists, but causes me to exist, loves me, and wants the best for me and for the world that he created. So the move from I believe in a higher power to I believe in God, I believe, is a relational move that says it's not just a cognitive belief. Hey, I believe in that God over there because I can see some aspect of that God in my life. No, I believe in God for me means that I've met that God in the person of Jesus Christ, and that something about that God is compelling enough to compel my allegiance for eternity. Now, how do we move from one to the other? I think the only way we move from believing in a higher power to allegiance to Christ is meeting Jesus in the persons of other people who believe in Jesus, know Jesus, serve Jesus, and in the scriptures, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, and through prayer. God has given us so many avenues by which we might access his presence. He's in us and all around us. And as we submit ourselves to that, as we open ourselves to the presence of God in our lives, we meet Jesus. And that, Betty, and the rest of you, is my answer to the question, how do we move from believing there is a God to believing in God? We meet that God person to person. And that changes everything. Well, that's my answer to the first question. I could talk about that one all day long, but we got to move on because there's another question to answer. And that question regards some recent happenings, especially down in the States. So the question comes to us from Ruel, pardon me, what is your take, and he's asking me, so what's my take on John MacArthur's defiance against ruling on public gathering? So as some of you may know, John MacArthur is a pastor of a big church down in California. And California has imposed some, well, personally, what I consider some fairly drastic legislation in order to prevent in their minds, prevent the spread of COVID-19 in California. And those measures have been fairly serious to the degree of canceling meetings like churches in their entirety. And there are lots of churches in California that have said, we're not going to comply with this legislation. We believe it's our right to meet. And so they've done so. And one of the most famous is the church pastored by Pastor John MacArthur. I hesitate to wade into conversations about specific pastors because I don't know John MacArthur personally, and I don't know all of the rationale behind why he's doing what he's doing. I've listened to some interviews and I've read some of his published work on that, but I can't know the man's heart. I've been asked by members of my family, actually, what would you do? What should we do if the same kind of laws are enacted? And that's why I write civil disobedience on the bottom. So what John MacArthur's church has done, and to hear John tell it, he didn't actually start this. It was started by people in his church. He was doing live streaming like I'm doing to our church, and people just started showing up in the sanctuary, and he said, hey, let's just keep this going. So there are a couple of things that that hit me about that kind of response. Number one, it's John's response and his church's response. And by that I mean, I don't think any church should look at what John MacArthur's church is doing and say we should do exactly the same thing. I think the reason I think that is because I just finished a degree in contextual theology that says we need to look at who we are, where we are, and what our context is to discern the work of God in our midst. So our church, Abundant Life, is not John MacArthur's church. Of course, it's not my church either. It's the Church of Jesus Christ, and we just serve him together. So my first reaction to what is my take on John's defiance of the mandate in California is I would love to know what his context is and how that drives him to be civilly disobedient. There are lots of places I think that we're called to be civilly disobedient when the government is acting in discord with its stated purpose, which is to bring peace, to maintain order. That's the stated purpose of the government in the scriptures. And so when the government doesn't do that well and it does it poorly, when it acts contrary to that nature, sometimes it's necessary for us to engage in civil disobedience. The challenge is we have to discern when that time is. When that time takes place. For John MacArthur, this is when he's discerned it's right for his church. And so I applaud John for his stance. I'm not sure if I would take the same stance because I'm not sure what it would look like here in Calgary. But I applaud John for his stance because I believe he has, with the Spirit, discerned this is right. Now, I think the challenge, this is point number 2 probably, I think the challenge for him is there is still a pandemic going on, right? So as a pastor, my first reaction when I heard that was, how do I balance, as a pastor, how do I balance the safety of my people, the people that God has given into my care for a time? How do I balance that safety with the need to meet as humans? How do I put those two together? How do I take into consideration the government's requirements and restrictions in ways that are faithful to the gospel in Calgary in 2020? And so as I look at John's response, I say that is one response. And he is... like most people, he's catching serious flack from the Christian community and serious accolades from the Christian community, depending on where you live and how you support. But I think in every way, I would want to step back and say, what is the best thing we can do for ALC? What kind of witness are we being to our neighbors if we obey the government restrictions or disobey the government restrictions? Are we being faithful to our call in the gospel to meet together to worship God? Are there ways we could do this differently? And this is maybe the peacemaker in me wanting to ride the fence and run both ways. Are there ways we could follow these restrictions and meet together in some different way? What we as a church have chosen to do, partly out of necessity, having no real physical place to meet because we sold our building, we're meeting online and in smaller groups. And so that's one way we've said we can still do this. It'll just look different for us. And I think if we're on point number 3, maybe this is point number 3. I've lost count of my points. Here's the real crux of the matter. In the end, nobody can shut down the church because the church is not a building or a meeting place. The church is the people of God. John has chosen this moment in history to defy the government in the way that he's chosen it. And I'm not going to weigh in and say he's right or he's wrong for what he's doing. I will say this, however. The form that church takes is far less important than the function the church serves. For me, for us as Abundant Life, I believe we can be effective witnesses to the gospel in Calgary by meeting as small groups for the time being while I continue to do online streaming. If that ceases to be true, then we as a leadership, we as a whole church need to reevaluate what it looks like to be faithful in Calgary. There are a lot of people right now who seem to know exactly what faithfulness looks like and want to tell everybody else how they're either being faithful or not faithful, dependent on their own understanding. And I'm not trying to do that. So my answer, my take on John MacArthur's defiance, it is one response, and I'm not going to say it's a bad or a good response, but it's certainly John's response. And it's his response with his congregation based on his understanding of the situation, his knowledge of his congregation and their desires. I will say this, when I have heard some U.S. pastors particularly, and Canadian pastors, talking about rights versus freedoms versus restrictions, that's when I get a little nervous. And the reason I get nervous is because we start to blend our political affiliations with our spiritual understandings, and we get things blurry. So I am not one that's going to stand, I'm sitting right now in front of you and say, we got to stand up for our rights. Okay, that's not going to be who I am. I am someone who is going to stand up and say, or sit down and say, we're going to be faithful to Christ. And if following Christ calls us into a time of civil disobedience, I think we have to do it. In my mind, we as Abundant Life aren't there yet. And I pray that we don't have to get there. But if we do have to get there, then thanks be to God, we'll go there. There are a lot worse things than being chucked in prison for a couple of weeks because we disobeyed the government. Being unfaithful to Christ is number one on that list. So my hope for this FAQ, especially for this question, is not that you'll write me angry letters saying, we need to open right now, or we need to stay closed forever, but that you will join with me in prayerfully discerning how God is leading us through this, what is an unprecedentedly difficult time for our church and for churches in our city and around our world. That we would be thoughtful, faithful witnesses to God in Christ, who is reconciling the world to himself. That we would learn to be agents of reconciliation in the midst of heated political debates and heated problems in our world. That we would learn how to be faithful in the midst of all of that. Those are, my friends, my answers to these couple of questions that you've sent in. Keep the questions coming. If you want to email me, send them. If you don't want to email me, send them anyway. I would love to read some more questions or hear verbally from you. I have some more on the docket, but always looking for more. Until next time then, God bless you. Have a fantastic week. We'll see you on Sunday. Take care.